computer is picking up a strange signal. Here, sir, you better take a look at it.
Hi, and welcome to Sci-Fi Snacks. I'm Liz J. Bradley, a science fiction author and poet who adores short fiction and snacks. Each episode of Sci-Fi Snacks is a short and sweet, or salty, discussion of what I loved, what I learned, and what I snacked on while reading new-to-me short science fiction. As always, links to the short stories are in the show notes, so if you haven't read this week's story, head on over, pick up your favorite snack, and then join me as we discuss this week's story. Welcome back to episode 22 of Sci-Fi Snacks. I am so excited to talk to you this week about this wild story called The Gernsback Continuum. It is by the author William Gibson, and if you have been listening closely, that name may ring a bell. William Gibson was the author of Neuromancer, which I shared my opinions on in an earlier episode. Essentially, that was a DNF book for me. So I was a little nervous going into this week with this story because I wasn't sure if I was going to enjoy it. And it always makes it a little harder when I don't enjoy a story right off the bat. Now, it doesn't mean that there isn't value to it. And I will start this episode by qualifying that part of this project for me is stretching myself and reading things I wouldn't normally and really engaging with those stories. Now, not every story I read makes it to the podcast, but I thought that it was really important that this one did because, as we'll talk about it, it is a really unique story and in a lot of ways has pushed me more than anything I've read for the podcast so far. How's that for a hook? That feels like a really good social media hook. But yeah, so let's get this thing started. The Gernsback Continuum was first published in 1981 in a science fiction short story anthology called Universe 11, which was edited by Terry Carr. The story is just under 6,000 words, 5,900 something, and it is a new subgenre for us called Atompunk. Now, I went into reading the story without doing the research on the subgenre first, and I think that was a disservice to me, just because I think knowing the subgenre specifics really helped me understand what I had read. And we'll get into that, but the definition from aestheticsfandom.com/wiki for Atompunk, which actually I'm going to link that wiki down in the show notes because honestly, they have really good definitions of everything for science fiction and different fandoms. It has been an awesome website to use. So their definition of Atompunk is it is a subgenre of science fiction that centers around a view of the future from the perspective of the 1950s and 60s. It is a darker version of retrofuturism. It often depicts imagery associated with, quote, traditionally American values, particularly a belief in the nuclear family and the suburban lifestyle. It does not center itself around a utopian future, but rather a dystopian nightmare. And that's the key here. The first half makes you think, oh, we're going for that like very Norman Rockwell vibes and that kind of thing. No, this is the reaction to that. This is the other side of the coin. So Atompunk is the dark underbelly of the 50s and 60s sci-fi characterized by potential dark futures in things such as Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep? Super popular title. You've probably heard of it. Satirical parodies of typical suburban American life, and more recently, satirical parodies of the ray gun gothic aesthetic, such as the show Futurama. So if you like Futurama, I have never watched it. I have seen clips and all of that, but Futurama falls into this Atompunk subgenre. So if you go into this story with that in mind, it will probably make a lot more sense the first time around. Now, for this week, I chose a snack that was a split-second decision in the store. Now, I was going to get gumdrops. And the reasoning for this is, I don't know how widespread this was, but in my middle school education, we studied atoms and we would build them with these like little wooden ball and peg things. But we would also sometimes do projects where you could do it with mini marshmallows or gumdrops. And you'd use like a toothpick and you would connect them all and make the different molecules out of the candy. And I loved that idea. And I was like, that fits perfectly with Atompunk. And then I just couldn't find them. I know exactly where to find them, but I was not in that store. And I was shopping with my 2 children. And if you've ever shopped with children, there comes a point where you're just like, grab stuff and go. This was one of those points. So I just saw that candy buttons on the shelf and I was like, you know what? Close enough. They're little circles. They're in different colors. I like it. And that's the point, is we're just having fun eating snacks here. So candy buttons on the paper. If you've never had them, they're delightful. I'm glad I ended up choosing them. We have a fun connection. Last week, I wasn't able to connect the snack very well. And this week, even though the snack was my second choice in a panicked moment of shopping with small children, I have a fun connection. So we will talk about that at the end. So you got to stick around to see how I connect candy buttons to the Gernsback Continuum. So the Gernsback Continuum was written by William Gibson. William Gibson is credited with having coined the term cyberspace and having envisioned both the internet and virtual reality before either existed. He is the author of Neuromancer, Count Zero, Mona Lisa Overdrive, Burning Chrome, Virtual Light, Idaru, All Tomorrow's Parties, Pattern Recognition, Spook Country, Zero History, Distrust That Particular Flavor, and The Peripheral. He lives in Vancouver, British Columbia with his wife. Now, the Gernsback Continuum is this wild little story that we can sum up in a couple of sentences. So the story's around 6,000 words long. But if I had to distill it down into 3 sentences, I would say a photographer, who is our main character, is hired by some people to take pictures of interesting architecture in the American Southwest that evoke Art Deco vibes. While taking said photos in the American Southwest, our main character starts to see things that are not there, including a big spaceship that's not a spaceship. It's like an airship that was theorized to be a part of the future but never came to be. So he consults with a professor who is versed in these kinds of things and aliens and sightings and things like that. And he says, it happens to a lot of people. And here's how you can get better. Does he get better? Not right away. Things get weird. You're not quite sure what reality is and what isn't, and things blend together. It gets super weird. He then tries to ground himself in a variety of ways, including reading and virtual reality, reading really trashy stuff, because somehow that is supposed to connect you better to the world. And in the end, he completes his photography project, which he really thinks is what triggered all of this. And he sends the things away and he gets on a plane to New York, and it's just, you can start to see things start to narrow. He's not having these hallucinations as much. And it is looking up, but not really. It ends on this really uneasy note. And I know that's more than 3 sentences. I tried to distill it, but I feel like I went off the rails. But also I feel like the story goes off the rails. One of the things I found myself highlighting a lot in this story because there were a lot of lines that really just hit me as either well written or really interesting ideas. And I wanted to share a few of them. One that I highlighted after reading the whole thing and doing a little bit of research and then rereading was the line, "In retrospect, I see her walking in beside Cohen under a floating neon sign that flashes, 'This way lies madness.'" So they were telling us right from the beginning, this is going to get weird. You take this job and you're going to go crazy. And yeah, that kind of summed up things for me. And I realized that was what happened. And that's what I had experienced. And I think it was really interesting how Gibson did that with the words on the page. Things like, "I penetrated a fine membrane, a membrane of probability. Every so gently I went over the edge and looked up to see a 12-engined thing like a bloated boomerang, all wing, thrumming its way east with an elephantine grace, so low that I could count the rivets in its dull silver skin and hear maybe the echo of jazz." And that's the moment. That's the moment where everything shifted in this story. Prior to that moment, it was just about our nameless protagonist, photographer, and the British woman who wanted to hire him to take all these photographs for her. And it was pretty straightforward. He's out there taking pictures of Art Deco gas stations. I don't know, maybe that's really a thing out in the Southwest. But that was the moment where things started to get weird. He looks up and he sees this airship that looks like a big boomerang. And it's as real to him as anything else that he's seen. And I love that line about penetrated a fine membrane, a membrane of probability. I was working on another podcast that talked about alternate histories and time travel and things like that. And that was one of the interesting thoughts that came up there, was talking about the probabilities. And when you're writing alternate history or you're writing time travel, possibilities kind of fan open in front of you, because if you change one tiny thing, it's that butterfly effect. What else changes? What are all of these things? And I thought that was such a beautiful way to put it in this story of penetrating that membrane of probability. So we're stuck on our plane of this is life, this is the trajectory, that's all of that. And then so thinly in the next zone or in the next universe over, the multiverse, right? We have that. It's such a popular concept now, but back when this was written, it was not explored that way. So this is like that multiverse. And all of a sudden, he's seeing things from these other realms of probability, these other universes, these other futures that could have been. And rightly, he's freaked out. And so he goes to this character, and this is one of the things that I really loved about this story when I started doing research, is that Agent Kin is a character that Gibson has used in multiple short stories. And I just, as a writer, I think that's so cool. Like when I was reading this story, it didn't do anything extra for me because I didn't know. But as soon as I started researching, I realized he's used this character who investigates weird stuff. Bigfoot, this is the guy you call because he's done his PhD on all these weird things. So our character knows of him and is, hey, this is the guy. And he basically is just, yeah, it's real. What you saw was real, but it's these, he calls them semiotic visions. So it's these symbolic visions of what could have been. And you're seeing it because you've been so involved in this photography project that kind of is pulling your brain towards these ideas. And then he basically is, I gotta go see this girl about her abduction story, and it's a lot worse for her. So, peace out. And he gives him some strategies. He tells him, read trashy stuff and go watch dirty videos because all of these base things will bring your brain back to here. It will ground you. And I just really love that we have this character who apparently appears in multiple stories in different places as almost this like plot device of information, this authority. And I thought that was really interesting. And I love the idea, I've always loved the idea of science fiction and fantasy as a genre that you can create a new world and then play in it. One of my huge influences is Anne McCaffrey. I grew up reading her. My mom was reading her when I was growing up. I've read every single Dragon Riders of Pern book, including all the short stories and the cookbook. Like, I have read them all, and I love that she could create this world and then just play in it and have characters cross over into different places. And I think that's just so fun. And so I love that was in this story. And it makes me want to go find him in other stories and see what he's doing in other places. It makes it feel so real. And I love that. I also really love this vision of the American Southwest, along with these semiotic visions. Now, the semiotic is a word I had to look up, and essentially it just means like symbolic. So the way it was explained in the story was that he is seeing these symbolic visions of a future that doesn't exist, but that we thought could exist at one point. At the same point that these Art Deco gas stations were being built in this kind of futuristic style with the hope of the people, and then society went a completely different way. These visions are tied so closely together. He's seeing what it could be. And I thought that was really interesting. And it tied back to another story, if you remember from season 1, when we read for episode 12, A Slightly Different Sunrise from Mercury, Nevada. That was the story about all of the atomic blastings in the American Southwest and how they ripped these portals in time in the area, and it became this like tourist attraction of go back in time and watch the nuclear bombs explode. And there's a whole lot more to it. I'll link that down in the show notes so you can go back and check that episode, but it's episode 12. It made me really intrigued about what makes this area of the United States so vulnerable or so primed for these kinds of stories. And I do think that it comes back to nuclear explosions are something that's so visceral and so much a symbol of human destruction and power and hubris and all of these things. And like, we harnessed the atom. That's total science fiction for so long, and then it became reality. And so I think that is definitely a part of it. It really makes me want to visit the area. I have friends who live down there and some family too in the Southwest, and it's not a place I've ever been. But I keep reading these stories, and the sci-fi connection is just so strong. I know that we have Craters of the Moon National Park out there, which looks amazing. And that's where they've done testings for communities on Mars and lunar walks and things like that, because it's almost this otherworldly place here on Earth. And I just think that's so cool. And now I think we can talk a little bit about what I've learned through this story, because this was a story that I had to read multiple times. I hit my head against the wall a little bit. And so we leaned more into the learning on this story. And what I really came away from this with was that this story felt very dependent upon the cultural context of the time in which it was written and the context of conversations around culture. And we've left the 50s and 60s, and he's writing this in the 80s, and he's projecting these futures where we don't have the widespread internet, we don't have widespread VR, or there is no VR, no virtual reality at this point, as far as I know. And so he's making a lot of educated guesses. I think all science fiction is of its time in the fact that we are painting a picture of the future based on the present. And the more I learned about what was going on at the time, I realized that there is so much to engage with in this piece. And the fears of the Cold War were going on at the time. So there's, this fascination with nuclear power and nuclear superpowers in the world, and which way is future going to go? Are we all going to blow ourselves up? Or is there a future for us? Was there a better future without world wars? There's always that tipping point in any sort of time travel, alternate history thing where it's, what if the outcome of the war was different? And so I think that this played on that a little bit with these multiversal visions. And then as I kept reading, I realized that there was a lot that I didn't understand on the first reading, and that a lot of smart people have written about in response. And one of the cool thoughts that I ran into was called hauntology. So that's smashing together the words haunting and ontology, which is also spectral studies. So that is, hauntology is a range of ideas referring to the return or persistence of elements from the social or cultural past, as if to haunt the present. And I thought that was such a cool idea. I think we see in our time a lot of idealization of the past. The 50s and the 60s, there's the whole Maha movement and the trad wife and all of these kind of fake idealizations of this Norman Rockwell-esque past that never was really true. So reading a story like this, where instead of it being a positive thing, they're looking at this underbelly, they're looking at these hauntings. It's the amount of dirty VR stations in this story was just like adding that seedy, grimy, icky grimness on the whole thing. And I thought that it was really interesting that these visions were not particularly inspiring to our main character. They were haunting. He was freaking out. He didn't see this thing and think, wow, I want to connect with these people. I want to see what's going on. I want to be on that airship. It was, this is terrifying. And it's just a totally different vibe than I think we look at the past, specifically the 50s and 60s with. And I was like, there's so much here that I know I'm missing. And I really thought that this is the kind of short story that I could write a dissertation on, like a whole academic paper, because there are just so many connections. And every time you Google one thing, you're finding something else and finding something else. And William Gibson wrote this nonfiction piece that actually caused a whole bunch of problems called Disneyland with the Death Penalty. And it was written in Wired, and he made this observation about Singapore. And he was calling Singapore is like Disneyland with the death penalty. It's this sparkly, super clean, squeaky, Disneyland. But also there's all of these problems with the death penalty and different things. There was this quote that he attributed to Laurie Anderson that said, virtual reality would never look real until they learned how to put some dirt on it. And there's just all of these connections that are being made, and it's making my brain fire crazy. It makes me think of the metaverse. If you've seen metaverse renderings and things like that, it's squeaky clean in unnatural ways. There's no dirt on it. We're never going to believe that we're sitting in a meeting in the metaverse with these weird avatars that are balloons. I don't know. It's weird. And so there's connections there and connections to things going on now. I can't help but read the title Disneyland with the Death Penalty and think of the United States now, where, oh my gosh, we do not have enough time on this podcast to dive into that. But like I said, I feel like this is a piece that will be tickling the back of my brain for a really long time. And I think the commentary there is really important and has evolved since the 80s for sure in ways that I would be really interested to hear Gibson's thoughts on this now. But yeah, so this all brings me back to our snack of candy buttons. Candy buttons to me are a very nostalgic snack. Like Necco wafers. They are something from childhood. They are the weird brand of candy where it's, I don't know, paper and candy. I feel like everything moved to plastic. And so candy buttons on a piece of paper feels vintage. And there is this happiness with candy buttons. So that's in opposition to this story. But I was thinking about it and I was like, they're so brightly colored, but then they just melt really quick. They're just egg whites and like a little bit of sugar and some flavor and some color. And they melt away so quickly, like a dream, like a vision. You can eat so many of them and you never feel full. And they're the weird, ghostly visions of a candy. And that's how I connected it to this story. I was like, we've got these weird ghostly visions of the past and the future that may have been. And we've got candy buttons that just melt away and it's like they were never there. All right, folks. Thank you for putting up with the shenanigans and joining me in the joy of this podcast. I am so excited to talk with people every week about their favorite stories, their favorite snacks, what they thought of everything. So don't be shy. Shoot me an email. Reach out on social media. I love hearing from you. Next week, we are going to talk about the solar punk story, Who Walks With You. It's linked down in the show notes. Give it a read, and I will see you next week. Bye.